right, hello everybody. Welcome to Politics and Prose. Let me turn on my own mic. You're at Politics and Prose in Union Market. This is one of our newer locations. We've been here since 2018, and the main store has been in Northwest since 1985. This evening, we are here to celebrate two books by two celebrated authors. We have Denny S. Bryce for her book In the Face of the Sun, and we have Vanessa Riley with Sister, Mother, Warrior. Just a few housekeeping notes. Thank you for wearing your mask. We are currently requiring masks for everyone in the store. We ask if you quiet your cell phones just in case they go off during the event. We're also filming as well. We will also have a Q&A section to this event. So once it's time, I will probably be passing around the mic I'm using right now, just so we can pick you up on the video, your voice at least. All right, so let me introduce our authors. Denny S. Bryce writes historical fiction and is the best-selling author of Wild Women and the Blues. She is an adjunct professor in the MFA program at Drexel University, a book critic for NPR, and a freelance writer. Articles she's written have appeared in USA Today, FROLIC Media, and Harper's Bazaar. She is also a public relations and marketing professional who spent more than 20 years running a public relations firm specializing in event management. A member of the Historical Novel Society, Women's Fiction Writers Association, and Tall Copywriters. Vanessa Riley is an award-winning author of historical romance, mystery, and fiction novels featuring realistic multicultural communities and powerful persons of color. To fuel her interest in the Regency era and early Victorian eras, she made time for attending Renaissance fairs and consuming period novels and films, while obtaining her PhD in mechanical engineering and a master's in industrial engineering, along with engineering management from Stanford University, as well as a bachelor's and master's in mechanical engineering from Penn State University. A frequent speaker at literary women's and STEM events, she lives in Atlanta, Georgia with her military husband and teenage kid. Please give our authors a round of applause.
Well, hi. How's everyone doing this evening? Good. Excellent, excellent. Well, Vanessa and I have been friends and colleagues, and she's my mentor in many ways, even though she's a child.
She's the baby.
But we spent years developing, working on our craft, talking books, talking the industry, and any number of things that come our way, and that have to do with the book world. And so the novels that we are going to talk a little bit about tonight, we're also going to expand upon our usual conversation about our books, and really also talk about the Black female protagonist and that impact of family, politics and freedom in fiction. And so we'll be expanding upon our, definitely talking about our own books, but also those pieces of history of the Black and or African American female experience, and how storytellers are doing a fabulous job these days and really pulling through history and identify some of the heroic, some of the powerful, some of the intriguing things about Black families, Black women through history. So that's where the journey we're going to go on for the next few minutes. I'm going to have Miss Riley begin by telling us a little bit about Sister, Mother, Warrior. We'll start there, and then we'll shift to, I'll talk a little bit about In the Face of the Sun, and then we're going to broaden conversation a bit. Okay?
Well, we live in a very unique world. where storytellers, all storytellers, are being given access to tell our stories in ways that haven't been before. There's publishing has often been a secret. So lots of people come in, but very few stories come out. And they want to tell a certain story. But over the past, I would say, 3 to 4 years, really at the height of the pandemic, we've seen systemic change in the publishing industry. There's never been a time where no matter what you look like, who you are, being able to tell your stories. And it's so important because the sensibilities, particularly when we're talking about a Black female protagonist, are very different if you don't have that experience. If you don't understand how important the Black family is, if you don't understand the politics, how it hits our socioeconomics differently than peers who haven't lived our experience, haven't been subjected to systemic racism, haven't been subjected to some of the things that is just part of our existence. And so I'm very pleased to be talking with you tonight about this topic because I think it's incredibly important. And I'm just also grateful in the moment we're in right now because it's, in my opinion, it's never.
And for me, as a relatively new author, Wild Women in the Blues was my debut novel, and it came out in 2021. And my sophomore novel is In the Face of the Sun. It's over there. But Vanessa's been in the biz for a while. She has more than 25 books. I think it's more than 25 right now. I used to say just 25 all the time. It's like, just a couple more and it'll be 25. And so her experience within the industry and the conflict that has happened within the industry over the years for authors of color is an experience that I have not had. Even though, as an observer of the industry for a long period of time, I've been on the board of directors of different writing groups and things like that. But as an observer of what's happening in the industry, I'm also thrilled to see these changes, this progress, and it's only the beginning of that progress. So when we talk about historical fiction in particular, because you can look through this store, just walking through this store, and see how many more books there are with people of color on the cover.
She just said that today. This is my daughter. In the last 20 years, she was 25.
Yeah.
I had to shop around for books for people of color.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. My son is an English teacher in Savannah, Georgia, where I live, and he's bringing in books by Angie Thomas. He's bringing in books, because he teaches high school 9th through 12th, so YA novelists are being a part of his curriculum that, and by the way, Angie's books are also banned, so that even in certain parts of the country.
Disregard that piece if you happen to live in the state that, because we want him to keep his job.
Well, also he's at a private school, so they can do what they want to do at private schools. But especially in historical fiction, because we are historical fiction writers, what we are able to dive into, as we have done in The Face of the Sun, for example, is a story about chambermaid in 1928 at the Hotel Somerville in Los Angeles, and then I do a dual timeline, so I also have 1968 as the counterbalance in these two stories fit together. But in 1928, factually, the Hotel Somerville was the first African-American hotel, or the first African-American luxury hotel that allowed African-Americans to, register at the hotel. Built by African-Americans as well as financed by the African-American community. I never heard of the Hotel Somerville when I stumbled upon it in 2017 when I was in LA at the film festival. So I wanted to write a story centered about that hotel because it was marvelous. And there were so many women who were a vital part of that hotel becoming a part of everything that was Los Angeles at the time. And specifically, Dr. Vida Somerville, the wife of John Somerville, but they were both dentists, both, well, he was Jamaican, and she was from Los Angeles. But there was just so many women who were looking to share their stories in a way, from newspapers, running newspapers, to being founders of the NAACP West Coast chapter. They were really pivotal to that part of time. So they were involved in the politics, but sometimes you not only don't hear the history, you don't hear about the women's role, because you've heard of W.E.B. Du Bois. You've heard it, I'm also doing a story in 1925 of Langston Hughes. You've heard of these male participants and contributors, but not necessarily the women. And that's a segue, I think, to talk about sisterhood warfare.
So in 2017, when Denny was discovering this hotel, I, like many others, was going to a movie that you might have heard of called Black Panther. And in Black Panther, there was the doorman, and these were powerful women, and they were protecting T'Challa, right? They were protecting the king. And someone happened to tell me that this was based on a true African tribe. And I was like, let me go look at that, because I've never heard of this. And they were absolutely right. The Dahomey was one of the most powerful tribes in Africa. And to protect the king, he had the Minos, which were these warrior women. They were the second-tier wives of the king. And their whole role was to keep the first-tier wives, the ones who were bearing his sons and daughters, safe, as well as to keep them safe. These women often, when it was time to battle, they were often at the head of the battle. That would be the first thing Europeans saw. And they were frightened by these women because the training is so intense. They are trained to not feel pain. Now, I don't know about you, but if you get an angry woman coming at you and she don't feel no pain, you better run. I'm just saying.
You're in trouble.
You're in trouble. And so these powerful women, we don't know their name, which saddens me. And then I kept digging, and I find a woman named Abadura. She was a gal, one of the gals, a leader within the army. So she's training these women, putting them through the paces. She gets captured and brought to Saint Domingue, which is present-day Haiti. Saint Domingue, for those who don't know the history, was the pearl of the Antilles. It is the richest colony during this time frame. And for every $5 that's circulating in the world, 4 of them are coming from indigo, sugar, and coffee. That's enslavement. Let's be very clear. Adam Smith talks about how wealthy this colony is. And this colony is prosperous. So much so that you have women of color beginning to be involved in the arts. So you have opera. And when you see this movement of people of people of color going into the arts, that should tell you the level of involvement of this particular country. But all of this is the underlying tensions of, people want freedom. This 1750 to 1830s is a time where everybody wants freedom but can't understand why somebody else wants it. So you've got the French Revolution that's happening, the Haitian Revolution that's happening. Those darn Americans, they're trying to get their stuff on.
Trying to get their
Portuguese, Spain, everybody's trying to colonize the West Indies because they want peace and money, all these resources. And then you even have interfaith fights between the Confucians and the Jesuits. I mean, y'all all Catholic. Why y'all fighting? But apparently they're fighting too. And so you have all this turmoil. Then you have in Saint Domingue, you see more of colorism. That it's present everywhere in the West Indies, but it's strikingly because they have called out a class called the colors. And they are supposed to have all the rights and citizenship that Caucasian Europeans have, but they are not. They are actually writing laws because this class is so prosperous that they have to lend money at certain interest rates to the Grand Blancs. They're forcing them to lend money to them, but they don't want to give these people the same rights and privileges that they're treating citizens. And then
Right.
under all of that, you have the free blacks, and then you have the enslaved blacks. So this constant tension.
It's a caste system that is very much so.
But once again, everybody wants freedom. They can't understand why everybody else has.
In the American, early American 20th century, where both of my stories, both of the books that have been published that I've written, take place, freedom is defined differently. I feel strongly about neither one of us are historians. We are history geeks. Our research is,
Everybody's got to come with this.
well,
I like that. Give me some credit.
give me some credit. But in the 20th century, Chicago is a central figure, and the newspapers, some of my key resources for me when I'm doing my research is definitely the black newspapers, Chicago Defender, California Eagle, Philadelphia newspapers, all of these resources, but at the time they were more than resources. They were a voice, a communication tool. I mean, the migration from the South to the North, when that started to kick off post-World War I, the Chicago Defender was actually acknowledged as one of the reasons for the migration, because the Pullman porters, for example, would take a Chicago Defender, get on the train, go down south, and the Defenders talk about, come up north. This is where you can be treated correctly or better. They didn't know that as soon as more black peoples moved up north, you had more violence in the north than you did in the south. That's something I'm learning as I do more research.
Yes.
I had a growing up in Philadelphia with older parents. It was like a central theme when the color people's paper came. And we would all sit around on the floor. My father would go from page by page, and that's how we were introduced to struggle, to civil rights, to do what he called, it's called a Tribune, but most folks call it the color people's paper.
Oh, Philadelphia Tribune?
Yeah.
That's right. I'm also right now looking through the archives of the New Amsterdam News and that's the New York, one of the oldest black newspapers in New York. But these newspapers, the role was so critical in communicating to family. And that's one of the things we want to really talk about tonight. One of the other topics, the black female protagonist and her interface with her family. In In the Face of the Sun, my 1928 character is 22 years old, and she has taken on the burden. She's a chambermaid, but she aspires to be a newspaper reporter. But she's taken on this burden of also being the person in her family that everybody else can rely on. So that means she's looking out for her dad. Her dad's a chauffeur. There were some interesting things happening in the 1920s for the Black Chauffeur. They had a whole big conflict with Filipinos who came into the area during that time. And the white folks who were in charge, what they hired the chauffeurs, let me put it that way.
The wealthy folks.
The wealthy folks. And, but some of them started to hire the Filipino driver before the black driver, and the black drivers, they ended up having a conflict over this. And I found this history interesting because it was based on color, because the Filipino driver was lighter skinned, but the black driver usually had been with the car so long, they knew the mechanics of the car. And since in the 1920s, these cars broke down all the time. So it became an important fact. Now, what I'm telling this story that I'm thinking, I don't even know if I put that part in the book because I really wanted to focus on my character, Daisy Washington. Yeah, I don't. But it was an interesting fact. This is the rabbit hole that authors were sometimes talking about.
For like 3 weeks for one sentence.
Yes, yes. The family relationship of Daisy Washington in 1928 was a close-knit family. She did what she could to help support them, and some things went awry. In 1968, Daisy Washington is almost 60 years old, and she is helping her estranged niece cross-country to escape an abusive husband. But there's a definite change in this. After 40 years, she doesn't speak to her younger sister, who she was very close to. But those secrets, those things that happen in family that cause distance, and then those things that can bring family back together, even after a long drought. In the 20s, another point that I'm going to shift back over here to Vanessa, another point is that people could disappear and reappear. And especially in the Black community, you had census, you had, but then you could change. My grandmother did this. She changed my grandfather's origin of where he was born every 10 years. And I never knew why until I found him in Ancestry.com. And he had been AWOL from a ship. He was a merchant seaman. And he also fought World War I, but for the French, because he was from French Guiana. So people can disappear and reappear. So I do talk about how, in both of my books, I talk about how people can be a part of a community, and then they can step away from the community, and then they can make a choice whether to return. And for the Black female, that became an opportunity, but also rather fearsome, because they'd lose the male members of their family, because it was, well, as we all know, the hardships of trying to succeed in whatever small arena you created for yourself was very difficult, because you could lose everything and it had nothing to do with your capability or your abilities. It's just, the way things could happen.
Well, let's step back to the mothering aspect. So in your story, Daisy becomes somewhat of a pseudo-mother figure, because she's the one that everybody relies on. And but you do such a wonderful twist on it. It's not what I would say, the typical, stereotypical way of the Black female assuming but somewhat pseudo-headship of family. There's lots of complexities, but we've all read the mammy complexes and whatnot in literature. With Gran Toya, she gets captured, she's brought to Saint Domingue, and because she knows herbs, she's able to improve the death rate, because the reason Saint Domingue has so many slaves is because they die. The average age was between 30 and 34. It was masses cruelty, it was hunger, it was the bugs in the environment and diseases. Yellow fever would wipe out hundreds of thousands of people a year. So we were always trying to bring new slaves in. But if you could keep enslaved healthy, you actually got more privileges over these plantations. So Abadura uses her knowledge. She knows the oils to keep the babies, because lockjaw was a thing, and the babies couldn't latch on. And so they would end up starving. So the masses give her the privilege to exercise the children. But if you step back and you look at what she's doing, it looks an awful lot like truth. Abadura used her position to begin, because she had a vision that there was going to be a generation that would raise up and be able to fight. So she begins to pour into these children. So instead of being that typical mother persona, she is more of a guide and a trainer. And one young man in particular, she teaches him how to look up at the stars using the astronomy that she grew up with, that she learned as a gal, so that he could position troops in the mountains. This young man grows up to be Jean-Jacques Dessalines. He's looked at now as one of the military geniuses. He did not go to West Point. He gets everything from Abadura. And I love how that steps out of the typical role, and you see the rebellion, because women, the reason the Haitian Revolution is successful, when all of the islands are in turmoil, all of them are having rebellions, is because of the women. I have not documented a rebellion with more women. We were leading, not just in supplementary roles, but Abadoya was leading troops on the battlefield. There's one famous battle where she got stabbed like 3 times and she still got a and kick butt. Another angry black woman. Same.
But also, we talk about, or what Vanessa's talking about, where you have this character, this female character, who doesn't display the norm heroics or the norm knowledge of trying to help and support her community. In The Face of the Sun, Daisy Washington, she goes from this 22-year-old idealistic young woman. Things happen in 1928 that start to rip away at that idealism. Other things start to happen during that 40-year gap, primarily having to do with the civil rights movement, and thinking about what occurred in America between 1928 and 1968, from Tillman to assassinations, and they go to the lynchings, the things. And here was someone who really thought that her writing, her ability to be in the front lines of communicating the positives about the civil rights movement, it's sort of like you get eaten away. There's a line that she has in 1928 where she says she's so excited about W.E.B. Du Bois coming to the hotel, and because he actually held the first West Coast NAACP annual meeting at the hotel a week after it opened. So just thousands of people came through. So she's thrilled. She's talking to her friends and she's saying, just imagine what the world is going to be like in 50 years, what the world is going to be like for Black people in 100 years. That's in 1928. In 1968, her character is very different. She's no longer idealistic. She is also rather hardened, but she still has a lot of passion. And I really enjoyed writing her because she's definitely not the angry Black woman, but what she is someone who finds a way of giving her niece strength, but indirectly, because she's been hurt a lot. So she shows her niece her inner fight, and also exposes her inner struggle in a very outwardly way. I won't give too much away about it. Daisy Washington was one of my favorite characters to write. She's 22 or 20 or whatever, I can't remember. But in 1968, she's around 60 years old. She's feisty, she's energetic, she loves fashion. She's just and she has a 1968 Mustang that she loves to drive fast. And I really just wanted to write that type of 60-year-old woman.
But again, that's turning some of the, I don't want to call it tropes, but some of the things that you normally see, normally written about, and on its head, because, another book, she would be the old wise cracking grandma, rocking in a rocking chair and things like that.
Right, and she's not rocking.
She's not rocking. She's turning over tables, I mean.
Yes, doing some other things.
and so in System of the Warrior, you have all this power in her, right? And she is trying to figure out how to right wrongs, because the Dahomey sold people to the Europeans. There are people who will try to apologize for these different things and soften it. They didn't understand. He was collecting the coins. He looked at his coins, and in the Dahomey world, when they captured a village, there was only 2 choices for the men. You were going to get killed, and he was going to cut off your head and then put it on the top of your palace, or he would send you down the road to the other. If you're a woman, they had 3 choices. They're going to decide whether you could become one of the Minos or a first-tier bride. They could kill you, put your head on top of one of their palaces for decoration, or they could send you down the river. Those are 3 choices, because they're not going to keep you alive so that you could somehow figure out how to overtake their kingdom. So they got to make use of you. And they sent a lot of people down the road to Ouida. And the road to Ouida is where the Europeans bought, sold, and transported Africans to the Western world.
I also want to, I was thinking about this as you were talking, I'd like you to talk about your title, and what the title ties in to the story. Because that sister, mother, warrior, we're talking about family, and we're talking about freedom, and we're talking about politics, and all of those three things come into play in that title. So please do that. Then I'll talk a little bit about what happened within the face of the sun.
I will do that. I will do that. But to balance, when I tell these stories, as Denny does, Denny is a master at a dual timeline. For me, I wanted to balance this fierce power of Abadura with soft power. Because to me, both power is important. And I was able to find a woman named Mary Claire Bonheur. Unlike Jean-Jacques Dessalines and many others, she was born free. And she could be one who would have privileges and whatnot, because in her lineage, you could see that the French, just an aside, but every one of these colonies, based on who colonized them, had different rules and regulations of how you would gain freedom. In the British societies, it was typically you paid a manumission, the enslaved called it a ransom. You paid that, there was documents, you kept those documents on you for the rest of your life because that proved you were free. Okay? Spanish had a different rule. In the French lit we have something called the Code Noir. And the Code Noir says that if you have a baby with your massa or your grown and he claims the baby, then you and the baby are free. You're now codifying certain responses. And in Mary Claire's lineage, there is some of this action of how her grandmother becomes free. But she is not that type. She's not wanting to use those privileges. There's a massive earthquake in 1770, and she and her mother go out and they feed people. The hunger becomes a calling for her. She's always trying to figure out how to feed the hungry. And in 1800s, there is a huge famine at Jacmel because it's under siege. The French forces are attacking it, the indigenous forces are there, massive casualties, people are dying, they're killing their horses. And when you kill your horse, you're pretty much just saying, I have no more. Because I'm done, because that's your transportation, that's your plows and all these sorts of things. But Mary Claire, knowing that the people are suffering, gathers young women with her, they dress in white, they get on a mule train, first of all, right? The mule. But she did this because she believed that if they saw these women riding on this mule train, everybody's going to stop. And they did. So literally both sides stopped. She is able to bind up women. She doesn't care whose side you're on. She sees somebody injured, she's going to fix them. She sees somebody hungry, she's going to fix your soup. Mary Claire Bonheur becomes the wife of Jean-Jacques Dessalines. So you have a mother figure that is a warrior, a fierce, powerful warrior. And you have a wife who is peace, another type of warrior. And then you have the relationship between Mary Claire and Gran Toya. Do they form a sisterhood? Do they form a mother-daughter relationship? Because there's an age difference between the two. And how they relate to their community. So that is how we get the title Sister Mother Bonheur.
And I'm going to borrow this to look up. Did you look up the Dream Variations? Dream Variations is a poem by Langston Hughes. I am a big fan of looking through poetry, in particular from the Harlem Renaissance, and now I'm paying more attention to the women poets of the time, but that's a separate story. But in Dream Variations, which I'm going to read to you right now, it's very short, but it's one of my favorite poems, and the source of the title, In the Face of the Sun. And get rid of the ad. To fling my arms wide in some place of the sun, to whirl and to dance, till the white day is done. Then rest a cool evening beneath a tall tree, while night comes on gently, dark like me. That is my dream, to fling my arms wide in the face of the sun, dance, whirl, whirl till the quick day is done. Rest at pale evening, a tall, slim tree. Night coming tenderly, black like me. This was written in 1926, and when I came across that poem, that line stuck out for me, In the Face of the Sun. And the whole poem is about facing day and night, black and white. And that is definitely a part of the story in The Face of the Sun. It's also facing your good side and your bad side, your hope and your dreams, your disappointments and loves and hates. So that yin yang was something that I wanted. That poem just really registered for me, especially after my publisher, because originally, for those of you who might have read Wild Women in the Blues, the original copy of Wild Women in the Blues in the back of the book has the first couple of chapters from the then titled book, Blackbirds. And then my publisher called me and said, no, change the title. We have some things we need to do. And so that's when I went to In the Face of the Sun.
But the poem, I love the line in the Face of the Sun, but I think the line before that, talking about whirling, that feeling of being free. Yeah. Oh, we started this talk about everybody wanting freedom. You have Daisy that is trying, to be free of the past, the guilt that's keeping her from her sister. You have Frankie that's trying to be free of a crazy person. Yeah. All the little, and then you come back here to Sister of the Warrior, and we're talking about freedom of people, freedom of religion, freedom to have your destiny and to control it. And then what does that mean afterwards? Because when Haiti becomes free, you have people who, they haven't run a country before. How do you, the economy, there's so many different things. What are you going to talk to people? And then there's still legacies of habitations or plantations still there. People still own land who left with the fighting. How do you deal with all these things? What does freedom look like? And to me, it's an exciting place that we live, that we are right now, where we can write about Black women, where we can write about these different topics through our lenses, because our lenses are different. Everybody's experience is very different, and the fact that we get to tell these stories, I am just so humbled and honored and thankful.
Oh yeah, and I think that thinking through history, books, history, nonfiction, over the centuries, over the decades, the primary writers of history were white men. So that is an important thing to remember, because you have to look at the politics of the time. These stories, or the fiction, nonfiction was written, even the fiction, but staying focused on historical information resources. Even a diary, women had to write in code, Black, white, or otherwise. They couldn't always just go forth and say exactly what was on their minds, because there was no avenue for that to be there. So as researchers, as historians and history geeks, we are taking that information and weighing in what we know about the politics of the time. So are we seeing exactly as something was? No. We know that because it's under the veil of so many other things that were critical. A book that will be out next year that I've written called The Other Princess is about Sarah Forbes Bonetta. It's my first biographical historical fiction. Sarah Forbes Bonetta was an African princess in 1850s, and a British officer saved her from the Dahomey and gifted her to Queen Victoria. And Queen Victoria ended up being her godmother and did a lot for her. But reading Queen Victoria's words, looking at the facts of the time as written in the time and how news articles in the British newspapers may have referred to her, to Sarah. And her real name was Anya, A-I-N-A. So taking a look at the facts versus what were the politics of the time. The Church of England was super powerful, and missionaries in Africa, their guiding force was to make everyone like them. That was their purpose. So what impact that had on all of these missionary schools where all of these African young women were educated and taught to be proper British ladies. So what did that do to their culture? How did that impact a young woman who was born an African princess and ended up in the royal family? So very, very much always, it's just fun. It's just fun to dive into history and try to, pull it apart and put it back together so that we're writing stories that are really interesting to readers. Because that is our primary purpose, is to be factual, but also be entertaining.
If you come for the story to actually learn real history, I'm not mad at that.
That's a good part.
But it's lots of fun. Next month, my very first historical mystery is coming out, Murder in Westminster. I found the most disturbing fact that I've ever found anywhere. When Haiti becomes free in 1806, all the abolition movements in the world stopped. We were good with y'all being free, but now y'all want to run. And so it takes a significant moment of time for the movements to start moving. And so I've designed a fully imagined woman. Her name is Lady Worthing. She's of Scottish and Jamaican descent because Scots and Jamaicans both have second sight. This particular sleuth, she's a detective. She's trying to figure things out. She has a gift with puzzling out different situations. And that, unfortunately, she's fighting with a neighbor, and the neighbor's estranged wife is found dead on their adjoining bits of her property. She doesn't want to go down for this, so she has to work with this man to be free. But that's how I love putting these extra nuggets, because I'm getting to play with politics of the time to show where people were really positioned, because a lot of things have been storyized. A lot of dissent has been taken out of our present narrative because it doesn't fit with the hero worship that we have now. And so I'm going to be able to tell you about what was going on in Parliament, who was on which sides of the fence and whatnot. And so I'm extremely excited about that, because it's another way to use history, but to be, like Jenny said, to be entertaining.
And have passionate characters who are fully rounded, not one-dimensional. And Vanessa and I also talk about, there have been some beautifully written over the years books about African Americans, about Black people from any part of the world, but sometimes they fall close to being in a category called, the word you used yesterday was something porn. Pain porn.
Oh, pain porn, yes.
Yes, where the primary story is definitely focused on the struggle and the pain of slavery, of enslaved, downtrodden stories, things of that story. And those are important stories that need to be told, but that's not the only story. We're also talking about, I don't always write about biographical historical figures, but I like to say that my fictional characters, are the heroes of their world. And that world may be 9 to 5, maybe chambermaid, maybe a jazz singer or a dancer in Chicago in 1925, or a young woman that I'm working on now who is married to a wealthy man who suddenly realizes for some reason that, oh my God, I think she's colored, so I need to get it.
I can fix that.
I ready to get in the moment. And it's actually based on a true story in 1925 called the Rhinelander case. That was a big news story because people couldn't imagine, oh my God, how did she get away with this? And how come he didn't know? You know us. But I'm looking, I think we had a single, it might be time to ask questions. Am I right?
Yes, time for audience questions.
Yes.
Does anybody have one or
more?
I'm really, that's kind of loud. I'm really curious about, like you guys were talking about how you're history geeks, and I was thinking like historically, for you specifically, women of any race have never been given educational opportunities the way that they should have been. A lot of women still are illiterate in a lot of different places, so I was curious about why you chose to make the main character of your book a writer. And especially during that time period specifically where like I'm reading other books with Black characters around between like the 20s to like the 70s even, and a lot of them are just like I can barely read. And you know, we already talked about like, you know, dismissing a lot of the tropes or overcoming the tropes, I guess. So I'm curious about why you wanted to make her a writer specifically.
Well, one of the key reasons, and because I must admit that I have a couple of books where I'm always having a character in the writing world, is that there were a lot of Black female writers, beginning with Ida B. Wells, who wrote extensively to attack the number of lynchings that were happening in America. Charlotta Bass was the editor-in-chief of the California Eagle and an advocate, civil rights advocate movement, and she started that newspaper in 1910. What I found in history is that those women, those Black women who ventured into education, there were quite a few. And there were quite a few very diligent, aggressive women who wanted to be out there and a part of the movement. So they made whatever sacrifice necessary to do exactly that. So, and I mean, I really found a lot of women. You know, you hear about a Nellie Bly. How many have heard about Nellie Bly? Was a white female reporter, 1860s, 1870s. She went into an insane asylum.
That's crazy.
Yeah. But she became the star. But there were all these other writers who were out there doing their thing. I also,
But
who was the other?
that goes back to how we started. The stories that are getting through. You're reading the stories that were acceptable, unfortunately, to traditional publishing, to a lot of publishing lens, even the buying public, because they don't believe that Black women can be educated, that they can achieve these different things. So authors had to fit their story into the lens of what they thought was acceptable to be published, because the lens was very, very, very narrow. But when you look at the actual true history, you find out there's so many more.
Well, like I mentioned, the Somervilles. Dr. Rita Somerville and her husband were the first two dentists to graduate from the University of Southern California, dentistry, African American. She was right there with him. She didn't hold back, but you might hear of John Somerville as being the guy, but he couldn't get anything done without her at his side. The whole idea of taking away from, I was thinking about this comparison, 1970s, for those who might remember, television, and the TV shows that were on at that time. I think that was the day of the Jacksons moving on up. Am I too far? Oh, Jefferson's, thank you, Jackson's.
Okay, where's your card? Give me your card.
Or black card.
Yeah.
I was just a child. But little humor. But the TV that was then, the magazines. I'm working on an article now, or a story down the road a little bit, and so I'm plowing through Jet magazines from the 50s. One of the cover stories, Jet magazine, African American owned, Mr. Johnson himself, and the cover page is famous or rich, fat black women you should know. And this is on the Jet magazine, and this is the way you're describing a comedian. I can't remember her name, but Ella Fitzgerald is in the magazine. And this is considered okay. We can have this, but that's in comparison to what was beauty in the 1970s if you weren't the same shade as Lena Horne. Or let's go more recently, and I'm not going to be able to, you know what I'm talking about. I don't. Thank you. No, girl, I can't. It's all this forwards. I can't keep up. But look at all of the attention because of this beautiful dark-skinned woman who gets 12 years a slave and is nominated for an Oscar, and her career kicks off, and all of a sudden she normalizes being dark-skinned. That's another sign of how time and what is being communicated to us as Black people over the years, especially if you can remember the 70s, if you can remember even the end of the 60s, as to what is normal and who is defining normal. So that's definitely something that we both look at with our history, is saying let's dig a little deeper. Don't take the surface explanation or description, dig a little deeper and see what's in it.
And, you know, as a writer, we make choices on how we're going to present our characters, how we're going to make them sound. Dorothy Kerman Thomas of Island Queen was my last year's historical fiction that I wrote. She was illiterate, or functionally illiterate, but she compensated. So the record's very clear. She would have 3 lawyers in the room reviewing stuff. She made sure that one of her daughters, she made sure all her daughters could read, write. She would make sure one of them was also reading the documents to make sure that it was all. So for her, illiteracy wasn't something that held her back. They say that she was a wonderful conversationalist. She learned because she was in the rich household. She was doing housekeeping. She learned etiquette. She learned how to enunciate and be very articulate. When she became one of the wealthiest women in Demerara, the politicians would come to her house to have tea and talk about politics. A woman that people would like to call literate. I personally believe she was functionally literate. You know, she could recognize certain words, she could talk certain words, but her language, you would never walk up to this woman and think she's literate based on her language, things like that. And so those are how we choose. This is the protagonist I choose to write about and the way I have my people carried in these books. The lens in the past, you would have a lot of broken English, you would have all these different things, because it was the assumption of that's how you people talk. But even if you are speaking in broken English, and you've grown up with something, you understand perfectly clearly what this person is talking about. You know what they're saying. So this artifice of broken language, et cetera, it's part of the lens that's been broken up because we need to go back and read the same thing. Yeah. How are people actually communicating and talking to each other and presenting ideas? It's so wonderful that we now have this opportunity. We, people of color, Black women, Black men, our Asian friends, everybody is getting a chance to tell their stories. And we get to find our heroes and return them. The ancients are crying out for their stories to be told. And I'm just so excited to be a part of that process.
good times. And more stories.
And more stories to come, because they left out so many people, it's ridiculous. I'm gonna be in business for a while.
We got stuff to do. Do we have more questions?
Great. We are at the, close to the end, but do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Let me think if I have a final thought. I do. It has to do with just being open to sharing the books you enjoy with other folks, because we want more people to know that stories are being told, stories are being written, books, indie bookstores like Politics and Prose are here and they're sharing whatever comes to them from publishers, and those are books we want you to take a look at. There are other titles, there are other authors that we enjoy, from Sonali Dev to Nancy Johnson to Piper Hughley. I think you have all of these books there here, I'm sure. And that's just
Or they can order them. I'm pretty sure they can.
Yes, they can. But that's even just a small taste of what's out there. But tell your book clubs, if you're into book clubs, tell them to send us a note, because I love it.
We love notes, we love zooming in, because that's one of the things one of the blessings of the pandemic is we're that much closer now. So we
Yeah.
can zoom in.
The world is smaller. I'm actually teaching a class in London in September via Zoom. Maybe one day they'll send for me. But until then, I just am looking forward to it. It'll be fun.
Yes. And of course, always requesting your local library. All of these things matter. And that's going to keep this moment we're in still open and not close up, because I would hate for this to be what they would call a fad. And if we're not, if people aren't talking about these books and are excited about these books, it will be called a fad. And we'll have to wait for another break. We don't need that.
All right, let's give our authors a round of applause. Thank you all so much for